On to the Philebus. Any more questions before we go on to the Philebus?
You're talking about titles.
About what?
Titles for the Philebus.
Oh yeah, titles for the Philebus. Against Ayn Rand, or Ayn Rand. Against self-interest rightly understood. Against utilitarianism. And also against Christian hedonism. One day I was in the dining hall. I probably said this story before. But one day I was in the dining hall and I saw one of my unfortunate former students. Because she said to me, "Oh, have you heard about the new cool economic theory that's out there? I'm a devoted follower." I said, "No, what is it?" "Christian hedonism." "What are you saying?" "Oh yeah, Christian hedonism. It's an economic theory based on pleasure. And that ultimately, even Christianity is the pursuit of pleasure." And I looked it up on the internet. I Googled it. And there are these, it's a group of Protestants who basically adopt all the philosophical principles of hedonism, only they say that hedonism should lead you to Christianity. It's bizarre, but this is one of the problems. No, but this is what happens. This is what happens when you don't have a tradition of trying to put faith and reason together. You can easily adopt all sorts of spurious philosophical theories, and you don't know anything. I remember one of the reasons I'm subjecting you to this pain of reading all of Plato's dialogues is because a colleague that I somewhat respect was basically telling us one time that Americans tend not to know the tradition of philosophy. That anybody who's educated as a philosopher should read all of Plato's dialogues, at least to the point of being somewhat familiar with them. Right? So not that you have to kind of read them all to know all the exact little arguments, but to at least be familiar with the major themes of the dialogues is very important. Because if you're just superficially aware of the Philebus, you realize what Plato says in the end, or what Socrates says in the end, that if you were to have kind of a hierarchy of values, pleasure comes in the 5th place. After all sorts of other things. Right? First is the eternal measure, moderation, fitness or appropriateness. Second, this is from point 66. Second is proportion, beauty, perfection, sufficiency. Third comes nous or human wisdom. Isn't that interesting? In the order of things, right? First is eternal measure. Second would be proportion or harmony. Third is nous or human wisdom. Fourth would be the sciences, the arts, techne, engineering, and true opinion. Fifth might be the painless pleasures. In other words, the pleasures of the soul and the perception. Sixth would be the pleasures associated with generation. I like the way he ends the dialogue, where he says, nous is the highest thing, N-O-U-S, not N-O-O-U-S-E, but nous, right? Nous is the highest thing in human life. It's more excellent than pleasure. Nous would be nous would be like the intuitions of a man or a woman who has spent a significant amount of time in their life struggling to grow in virtue and to grow in knowledge of the highest things. So it would be like what a saint could tell you. Right? That's what nous is. Nous is what a saint could tell you about life, about living. Right? Well, he says nous is the highest thing. And it's by far more better in human life and more excellent than any transitory pleasure. But he also says that neither the mind, right, even what our mind can come to know, nor pleasure is the absolute good. It's the divine, it's the eternal reason that is the absolute good. The mind itself and pleasure, they lack self-sufficiency, they lack adequacy, and they lack perfection. At the same time, he says, and this is Eros, right? At the same time, he says, still, if we were to take nous and pleasure as competitors for the absolute good, nous would be in a much higher place than pleasure as far as fulfilling the absolute good. Pleasure could never be in the first place. Even if all of the cattle, horses, monkeys, and other beasts of the world were to say otherwise. Right, this is in 67, right? I'm always going to maintain that nous is the highest, it would be the highest good of man, even if all the horses, the monkeys, and the cattle, and the animals of the world and beasts of the world were to argue to the contrary. I think that's a pretty nice way of putting it. In other words, we're not animals. Right? Those who deny, I mean, to kind of put it in a contemporary context, those who want to, basically, ultimately, those who want to choose, those who argue for contraception, they're putting some lower good, whether it's wealth or reputation or pleasure, they're putting some lower good above the pursuit of the divine, which comes through the sacrificial love of marriage. And they're basically, ultimately, the argument, I mean, I hate to say this, but their argument is they're turning the marriage bed into a kind of cage for animals. They're making procreation a kind of animalistic thing. They're making humans into beasts. And the same would be those who advocate or engage in premarital sex or adultery or any kind of affection outside of marriage. You're turning the human person into an animal. And that would also be the problem of, we were talking about this on the way over here, any forms of dance, right, that would basically change dance from courtship into stoking the passions would be a kind of bestiality. I mean, just to kind of say it. We're in a family establishment, so we can say those kind of things. Right?
You still putting those lectures on the internet?
Yeah.
Good.
So, but ultimately, that's what the Philebus is driving at, right? That Eros understood. In other words, Eros understood as the sexual passion is still in the sixth place. If you want to associate a kind of Eros with nous, that's going to be the highest in human, but even that is third place with respect to the divine.
This makes sense, though. I mean, just given all of the dialogues, it's the same order he just repeats over and over.
Yeah.
It's enumerated differently here, but
yeah.
It's the same general idea. You can't have something down the list without having first mastered the first. You can't have courts without having mastered moderation and down the line.
Right. And actually, it's kind of interesting. I remember I've seen many videos of Saint Jose Maria, and in several videos, people ask him questions along these lines, and he'll say, "Look, for the ordinary person." For the average person, for the normal person, the pleasure that comes from sex comes in fifth or sixth place, as far as in the order of goods of life. First comes your friendship with God, then comes your wife, your children, your family, your friendships, and then maybe comes the pleasure that comes from generation, right? So in other words, in a life that's properly lived, this will be given its proper place in the order of things. Now, having said that, maybe some highlights from the dialogue. Basically, I mean, the first part of the dialogue is, the dialogue starts out with, by the way, I'm really disappointed in the introduction in the Red Book, the introduction to this dialogue. As with most introductions, it completely misses the point. I mean, it kind of sets up the problematic, but I think it completely misses the point of what Plato's trying to do. But anyway, that's just my personal opinion. The dialogue starts out, okay, the conflict is wisdom or pleasure. What's the greatest thing, wisdom or pleasure? And what he basically argues is it's a third thing. There's a third thing we're looking for. Right? Wisdom is not the ultimate standard of human behavior, nor is pleasure. There has to be a third thing. Wisdom here, I think, is understood as not wisdom as in like the perfect man living the perfect life, but wisdom would be a kind of knowledge that the human intellect comes to. And neither alone is perfect. Why? Well, because obviously, if you think of pleasure, can you have an infinite amount of pleasure? Well, ultimately, to know, you would have to have some knowledge to determine whether the pleasure that you're experiencing is good or bad. Right? Just to have infinite pleasure would not be you would have to have some knowledge to know whether that pleasure is good or bad. So pleasure can't be an absolute. So in other words, that shoots down Christian hedonism right there. By Christian hedonism. Right? Nor can wisdom, nor can knowledge, you might say, be an absolute. Knowledge can't be an absolute because to simply know things without experiencing any joy or any happiness in your knowledge of things, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Right? To simply know, but to never have any enjoyment would also be, you wouldn't really, then you would say to yourself, well, your knowledge, how do you know it's good? So there has to be a third thing. And in the course of going through this, he starts to talk about the 1, the 2, and the 3, and the 4, and the 5. He's basically, I mean, if we were to spend a lot of time on this, what we would do is he's laying out the big metaphysical principles within which we understand pleasure and wisdom. The infinite, causality, whether there's a limit to things. And ultimately, right, ultimately in our human experience, we don't set out to experience infinite pleasure. We don't set out to experience infinite wisdom. Ultimately, there is a kind of limit that is put on these things. Limit is law or custom or virtue, which limits these things so as to harmonize them so the human soul and person can become perfected. There is a kind of perfection which is a harmony of the human person within the divine order of things. And that's what, at this point, everything we're reading is looking forward to the laws. In the end, we're not sophists. In the end, it's interesting. He says we're not governed by the irrational. We're not governed by luck. We're not governed by power and chance. And to some degree, the sophists would say these are the things that govern us, and we have to develop mechanisms for limiting these things. This is what Machiavelli does to found modern political philosophy. He says ultimately we're governed by fate or chance, and the goal of modern political philosophy is to try to limit the influence of chance or fate in our lives by acquiring power. If we acquire, I'm referring to point 28. But Machiavelli basically builds on this point, 28. If we can acquire power, we can eliminate or reduce the amount of chance in our lives, or necessity. Ultimately, you might say one of the things that Plato is driving at is that what is the role of necessity and contingency? And I think what Plato is saying is that, yes, we humans, we are contingent, but God, he's driving us in the position that the only thing that's necessary that God is, and that God, ultimately the Christians will say, the only thing that's necessary is that God is and that God loves. Nothing else is necessary. So we are never of necessity forced into one way of acting or another. That's all contingent. And I think Plato is trying to say, the sophists are trying to say that much of human action or much of human behavior is of necessity. Our drives, our instincts, our passions, they are of necessity. So we develop structures to control them without undoing them. I think ultimately Plato is trying to say there's a lot of human action that is contingent. And so we want to push as much as possible of what is necessary to the divine. And somehow we humans in our contingency, our goal, you might say, is to choose, is to use our choice so as to live in harmony with what is necessary, with what is. With what is what is necessary. What is contingent can change and can make itself in conformity with the necessary or not. Right? I mean, I know that's kind of far out, but I think that's what we're driving at here. So, the goal, you might say, is to say, well, what is the relationship between necessity and contingency? How do you harmonize them? And at 29, he says, yes, there is an order that we decipher in things. At 30, I think in the end, we'll get into this more in the Timaeus, but ultimately the universe is a body, and the universe, because it's intelligible, it has a form. The sum of wisdom is to discover the harmony or the order in the universe, and then to make the body and soul healthy within that harmony or within that order. The fairest nature of all, who's the fairest of them all? The fairest of them all would be the nature that discovers this harmony that's in all of things and that lives in unity with it. There is a wisdom or a nous, an N-O-U-S, of infinite things. And there's also a wisdom or nous of how the finite relates to the infinite. There are divine rules to things. And the fairest of them all would discover these things. Right? The fairest of them all would not just look in the mirror and discover her own beauty. Well, you might say the fairest of them all would discover her own beauty, but her own beauty in the divine order of things. Was Walt Disney trying to subvert Plato? Well, he was a kind of Gnostic. He was a kind of agnostic Gnostic. So he could. I mean, there's a possibility. Huh?
I can be an agnostic Gnostic.
Well, you can be an agnostic Gnostic. Because an agnostic, right? An agnostic, no, that's not that hard to understand, right? An agnostic is someone who is not sure about whether God exists or not. He punts on the question of whether God exists or not. A Gnostic is someone who just, in the end, punts on the question of ultimate truth and just grabs on different things, grabs together different things and throws them together to make them look attractive. So that's an agnostic Gnostic. So Walt Disney it wouldn't surprise me if he was an agnostic Gnostic. Another cultural icon shot down.
Frozen? Like, is he?
Yeah, he is. He's still frozen.
Is he gonna be like?
That's another sign that he's an agnostic Gnostic. Walt Disney.
It sounds like a song.
Yeah, it
A
does.
Disney song, the agnostic.
No, he is.
Yeah.
We are
How does
the
that work?
agnostic.
Yeah. We got to think of, what would that be? The agnostic Gnostics. Agnostics, Gnostics. We punt on the question of God and philosophy. Agnostics, Gnostics.
George Washington drinks.
That would have to be the tune. Agnostics, Gnostics. Agnostics, Gnostics. Right? It has to be something like that. Right?
I'm sending my parents home.
So we have the infinite. We have the infinite. The finite puts limits on the infinite. Wisdom is to discover how the infinite relates to the infinite and to create a kind of harmony with it. Right? True pleasure would be pleasure that is somehow in harmony with the divine order of things. True perception would be the soul understanding its sensory perceptions, and again, in harmony with this divine order. There can be false pleasures and pains. False pleasures and pains are pleasures and pains that we experience or perceive, and we give them an importance that is out of whack or out of harmony with the divine order of things. And then it's in the context of this that he gives the analogy of the soul being a book. It's a book. It's a book. The soul is a book like the Little Prince. It has both writing and illustrations in it. The truth. What? Well, I think it's what he's saying. The truth is the words, right? True opinions, true statements, or knowledge are the words that are written in the book that are true and in harmony with the divine, that explain the divine order of things. If there are statements that are false that need to be edited, those are false statements, false opinions, or ignorance that is somehow written in the book. Along with the written word, there are illustrations. The illustrations are the images of words. They can be true or false, that give us images of pleasure and wealth and anything else that could be a creation or an experience of man. Someone who has a true man has images in his book that lead him to friendship with the gods. A false man has images in his book that give him the false expectations of pleasure that would lead him away from union with God or friendship with God. So the healthy man, the goal in life is not to do away with pleasure, and it's also not to do away with pain. The goal in life is to make a harmony of these things. In fact, he critiques this. He critiques what would become the Stoical theory. The Stoics will say the goal of life is to suppress pleasures and pains. Socrates is going to say no. That ultimately we want to harmonize pleasure and pain, directing it towards friendship with the divine. We want to be self-restrained and moderate, not like the intemperate who follow the passions to the extreme. We want to avoid the extremes of passion: anger, fear, yearning, mourning, love, jealousy, and envy. One of the problems with the theater, he says, is that the theater stokes these. Right? The theater tends to stoke these passions. Well, all poetry tends to stoke the passions. This is why at the end of the symposium, Socrates tries to tell Aristophanes, the comedic poet, you should also do tragedy. And he also tells the tragedian, Agathon, you should also do comedy. You shouldn't dedicate yourself to one brand of poetry. You should try to moderate it so as not to give in to the extremes.
So what is he saying? Like, you think, they're saying, like, you know, you're supposed to moderate your poetry, and he's, like, saying that, but, like, sometimes it's read like, you know, he just doesn't like poetry, period, or whatnot.
Well, again, I think that's kind of the modern way to just misinterpret Plato so as to discard him. Is you create a straw man of him so you don't have to take him seriously. Because I think what he's really saying in the end, it's like at the end of the Republic, he gives a challenge to the poets. He says, try to basically write poetry that leads people to discover the truth, rather than distorting the truth and leading them to indulge their passions, thus enslaving them.
Would you say that there are certain forms of pleasure, or rather, or even in this theater, certain forms of poetry that simply because of their style are intrinsically opposed to discovering the truth?
Yeah, anything that exaggerates the passions.
That exaggerates them to be like revolutionary?
Yeah, it's subversive.
So in what way, I guess, would it be?
I mean, in other words, the monologues, right? It's a form of subversion. Or at the very least, it's a form of what St. Josemaria calls Confusionism. What is Confusionism? Confusionism is using the truth as a mask for subversion. Right? In other words, you use something that is true and good as a mask to incorporate an agenda that is subversive of the truth into your whatever it is you're doing.
That's pretty clever.
It's extremely clever. Right? So people will say, oh, when we do the monologues or when we do Loyal Daughters or blah, 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 we're just saying what's true. Right? And there is a half-truth to what you're doing. But it's using the truth as a mask to incorporate subversive ideas in that will subvert the moral order in the end. And that's a tactic that's common since at least the French Revolution.
Well, okay, so what forms, like, I was having a conversation with somebody this past week, and he was like, well, John, if you were taking morality and modernity, you'd understand that there are no absolutes in discourse anymore, and everything's sophistry. Because I was reading the Phaedrus, and I was kind of telling him what it was about.
Yeah.
I said, everything's sophistry. And so if you can't beat them, join them.
Oh.
And so wait, what he was saying was, in some cases, I know just like, is there a time when, like, appealing to somebody's passions is okay? Like, in what context would it be okay to appeal to somebody's passions?
I think it would.
Not the revolutionary way.
Yeah, it would be in the context of a statesman. In other words, in one of the dialogues, I think it's in this dialogue, Socrates will compare himself to Gorgias, right? And he will say, Gorgias says, it's in this dialogue, it's at 58. You don't need to look at it, but Gorgias basically says, he makes this contrast between himself and Gorgias. Gorgias says, remember Gorgias is from the Gorgias.
Was he the first one?
He's the first
He
one.
was the very first one.
Yeah.
And then it was.
He's the kind of refined.
Who was the next
He's
one?
the refined
There was
hedonist.
Callicles.
Then Paulus and then Callicles is the last one. So Gorgias would be like Montesquieu, right? Or John Rawls, or John Dewey or Bertrand Russell, kind of the refined hedonist who doesn't take the mask completely off, or Richard Rorty. So Gorgias says that the highest art, the highest science, is the science of persuasion. So if there's no truth and we're all just a bunch of freaking sophists, as they say in morality and modernity, well then there's no such thing as philosophy. The highest science is the science of persuasion. And so if you can learn how to persuade others to adopt your position, you will gain power, and you will, in a nice and friendly way, get everybody to do what you want them to do. That's what we call cultural subversion. Without using violence, you use the theater, the media, and journalism to get people to adopt your power structure. That's what modern feminism does, modern ideologies, most civil rights movements. I mean, not to kind of trash everybody, but that's the way most people operate. Right?
I gotta cook.
Well, no, it's true. I mean, but the typical student in class, they'll say, "Oh, everything is relative. Everything is relative. You can't impose your truth on me." Well, if that's the case, then what are you trying to do? Right? You're just trying to be more clever in the way that you get power over me. If everything is relative.
I had a Langdon moment this weekend. I just remembered it. I was in the car, and we were driving to Steak and Shake, and we were talking. It was like a bunch of like people who were like Catholic in the back, and we were talking about how the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church come together. And I said some sort of passing comment that people were saying, "Oh, no one actually do anything. There'd be just a couple thousand people, or whatever, like that." And I was like, "Well, if we can at least save one soul." And the one person got really offended by that, and they were like, "What do you mean by that?" I was like, "Well, I mean, I respect their faith, but you can't have the true faith." I can't believe you're saying this. I thought you were a good person.
I thought you were a Mason like everybody else.
So I was like, shut up then.
I thought you were a Freemason like everybody else.
I was like, what would Jeff say?
Are you a Freemason?
Point Jeff.
No.
They ask you that when you join.
Well, one problem with Freemasonry is that if you become a Freemason, you're excommunicated.
Well, you know what? Essentially, I was listening to WHLY the other day, and somebody called in the call-in questioning shows. It's what, 1560 a.m.?
Oh, yeah.
So if you guys have one, it's Catholic radio station in South Bend.
In South Bend, yeah.
Yeah, it's really good.
Our next door neighbor is the promoter of it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Excellent. Anyway, somebody called me that question because they removed that after Vatican II from the actual document.
Oh.
And so they tried to argue that you can still be Catholic and join.
Oh.
It's like, well, you could in theory, but what do they believe, and how does that fit with Catholic teaching, and how does it fit with joining a group, affiliating yourself with it? Right.
Well, that's a good point though, because a lot of things at Vatican II, it wasn't that the Council Fathers were trying to say these things aren't bad anymore. Mm-hmm. They were basically trying to say we're going to take away the punishment in the hopes that you come to see on your own how bad these things are. I mean, that's kind of the. In other words, we don't have the index anymore. Why? Because you have to be responsible for determining what's good to read and not to read. It's still the case. I mean, whether there's the index or not, if you read something that's bad for your soul, it's still going to hurt your soul. Sorry.
Well, don't they still put the original Obstat on books?
No, that's done.
Yeah, but it also doesn't mean so much.
I see it sometimes.
They still do it, but it doesn't mean as much as it used to mean. You can anything can get in.
There's this book that's called Good Goats, Healing Our Image of God. It basically says that hell doesn't exist, and it has a impermi potest, which I think religious orders give it. And he actually says at the beginning, this teaching is in line with church teaching. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to get the impermi potest at the beginning of my book.
Complete sophistry. Complete sophistry. So anyway, go ahead. Yes.
I just want to follow up with John's question. I guess.
What was John's question?
Whether or not there's a time place to appeal to passions.
Oh yeah, this is what I was. Yeah, no, I haven't finished answering it.
Okay. Well,
yeah, so I'm glad you brought us back to it because we got off track. I was just about to ask, where were we? So, if Gorgias is right, then we should manipulate the passions to control them. We should basically do what Israel did when they invaded Palestine and have a 9 o'clock curfew and then start broadcasting pornography into the Palestinian homes, right? Because that's a way to start to control people.
They did that?
Yes. It's a classic form of control.
Is that well documented? Is that accurate?
I mean, it's not, no, because it's you can't, this is the kind of stuff that would never make it into the American media. But you can read it, you can read it in the Australian media, which is more open in some of these things.
It's really bad.
I know, but it happens.
Pornography, how loose are we using the word pornography? Was it generally accepted pornography, or was it just what you and I would call pornography? You know what I'm saying?
Well, what do you mean? But I don't know what you're talking about there.
It's generally accepted.
I mean,
was it something called illicit dreams? Was that the name?
No, yeah, no. In other words,
regular primetime television.
No, it was real. It was It was hardcore pornography, not soft porn.
Okay.
Which is what primetime is soft porn.
Okay, so I guess that's what I meant. See, I don't know the terminology.
Yeah, I don't know either so much. But basically, primetime is soft porn, and hard porn you gotta feel a little guilty about watching it still.
But of course, that guilt is just a construct.
It's just a social construct, yeah, imposed on you, right?
It's relative to our moral beliefs.
Yeah, exactly.
Morals?
Exactly.
What?
Anyway, we got to answer the question here. So.
I think we're dogs kind of funny.
So anyway, for Gorgias, that's what you can do, right? You can just use the passions to manipulate people.
You think in a good way,
No, for Gorgias, there's no good way. For Gorgias, all there is you getting power. Okay? What Socrates says, no, in the end, there's a science of being, of truth and goodness. And what you might say in one. Being, truth, goodness in one are the transcendentals. And ultimately, the statesman. Ultimately, this science is the science by which we can determine whether any other science is good or is used well or poorly. So ultimately, the philosopher is the one who... Excuse me. Ultimately, the philosopher is the one who understands the one, the true, the good, and the beautiful. The statesman learns these things, and he learns how to put the art of persuasion, the art of politics, and science in relation to the one, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so he learns to what degree obviously you never fully suppress the passions, but the statesman learns how to, you might say, the statesman learns how to enable people's passions to get riled up at the right things. And also, at the same time, not to go to an extreme. Right? So, the statesman avoids both the extremes, and he also avoids the passions, he might say enables the passions to get riled up in a limited way towards the right things. So he regulates. So he'll say in the laws, I think, he regulates marriage, so that the passion for generation is regulated in the right way, in the right moment, in the right circumstances, towards the right objectives. I mean, marriage is the most obvious example. Politically, then, you could also say that the statesman will let the people as a whole, WHOLE, get riled up in the right way so as to defend their way of life. That would be just war theory.
You reminded me kind of Philebus in the Republic, where he talks about how his passion is basically dead.
Yeah.
He's not able to stick around for the argument.
Right.
Do you think that passion, a certain degree of passion, is even necessary for dialectic?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Because Cephalus, ironically, is a man without logos. He has no desire for logos. So there is a passion for logos.
Sick with passion for hearing people speak.
Pardon?
It's like Socrates in the Phaedrus says, you've caught me in my one desire.
Yeah.
Man who's sick with passion for hearing people speak.
And actually, this is related to the Timaeus, because the Timaeus also introduces us to some people who lack a full cephalus. They lack a full head for logos.
What's the significance of his sort of complete lack of passion? Like, would you say that his character in the
Well, the thing,
it's
it's not a complete lack of passion. It's a complete lack of passion, but it's a complete lack of the desire for knowledge, like the desire of the soul.
But then he goes and offers sacrifices. What is that? Is there any significance there?
I'm sure there is. I mean, maybe he's like Euthyphro, and that he has a kind of religion understood as duty is what negates his passions.
So it's sort of like a puritanical...
Yeah, that's the danger of our culture. Duty suppresses. Religion is understood as duty, which is a suppression of passion. Or, if you're anti-religious, you say, to heck with all the duty, I'm just going to go wild. So have I answered the question? I mean of the statesman. The statesman is the one who knows in the city how to basically direct the passions of the citizens. And the statesman of the marriage is the woman.
Is that what you're just saying? Or?
What was that again? No, what was the comment before? The statesman?
The statesman of the city is the one who knows how to direct the passions of the city for the good of the city. And the statesman of the marriage is the woman. I think that's true. I'm not saying that. I think that's true.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
They're the Philebus of the marriage too.
No, not at all.
Didn't you say that once? Or the intellect is, the will is what's modeled by the man, the intellect.
Well, no, the Cephalus is without reason, without logos.
No, I mean the Philebus in the etymological.
The logos of the marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah, the woman is.
Philebus mean in?
Yeah.
Which is ironic.
Yeah. Yeah.
He always does that.
So ultimately, in the soul, in the person, there are three ridiculous forms. The person who pursues wealth, the person who pursues physical pleasure, and the person who pursues science. Right? Ultimately, these are all false claims to wisdom. They lead to faction and strife. They lead to a kind of false pride of wisdom. And added to envy, they will destroy each other. Those who have envy are ridiculous.
Where is this at right now?
This is at 49. Those who have envy but lack power are ridiculous. Those who have envy and can get revenge, they are hateful, whether they can avenge real or false injuries. Right? Envy is to rejoice in or to get pleasure from the harm or misfortune that comes to another. If we laugh or joke about the ridiculous qualities in our friends, this is envy. This is taking pleasure or a kind of vengeance in the demise of another. So Kaleidoscope McDaniels is a form of envy. It is. That's what blasphemy is. It's creating a false image and then taking pleasure or delight in the downfall of the false image. Right? So having the president smoke marijuana is creating a false image of the authority of the president, and then it's taking delight or vengeance almost in seeing him depicted in this way.
In fact, we laugh at
girls
that
at
show, but we're
Scrubber.
just becoming revolutionaries and we don't even realize it.
Exactly. Well, no, our culture is a subversive revolutionary culture.
Huh. Well, I feel bad for laughing at that comic now. Does that mean I'm on the right track?
Yes. I mean, no, our culture, ever since the 60s, is a subversive culture. Our humor is subversive, our music is subversive, our films in general are subversive. Even films oftentimes that are good, there will be one or two subversive elements that are purposely in the films, so as to always sneak in that little subversive element with the good that is presented. Confusionism. Okay, we went through in a sense that we went through the middle part and the part right after the middle part. We're basically saying ultimately there's a standard. There's a standard by which we can judge what is pleasurable, what builds up and what destroys one's life. There's a standard by which we can judge all the technes and all the knowledge that we can acquire, all the science that we can acquire. There's a standard by which we can judge music, building, shipbuilding, and house building. This standard is a kind of philosophy. It's a kind of philosophical geometry. It's dialectic. It's the art of the philosopher. That standard can also judge the art of Gorgias, the art of persuasion. So the statesman, he knows both philosophy and the art of persuasion. And he also knows the principles of the arts. He knows how to bring them all into a kind of harmony with the eternal. A man who has true wisdom about justice, this is 62. A man who has true wisdom about justice and reasons in accord with this wisdom, he has the true measure of knowledge about things. He knows the divine, he knows the human, and he knows how the two relate. Anyone who attempts to lead who does not have this knowledge is ridiculous. He would be like a doorkeeper who has a mob outside of his door and he lets in everybody without discriminating between them. It'd be like someone who lacks true wisdom and he doesn't know about the pure and the impure and he just lets everything in. Right, this is the person who engages in pleasure in an unrestrained way. He lets all the pleasures in without moderating them.
What did you just say? Letting all the pleasures in
without moderating them. The opposite defect would be to... The opposite defect would be to completely eliminate the pleasures,
So I'll have like one.
to see that somehow they hinder or disturb us, or make us mad. Ultimately, we should allow the pleasures in such a way so that we can still acquire wisdom. But we should not allow in the base and the vulgar pleasures, because they're based on a lie. They lead to folly and baseness. It would be senseless to try to discover how to mix in the base and the vulgar pleasures with the truly beautiful. It would be senseless to pursue the knowledge of the divine with the base pleasures in mind.
So that's what we were talking about earlier. There's some.
So the true mixture should be the pleasure of the soul. The true mixture should be the pleasures of the soul with true knowledge.
But there are some physical pleasures that are okay, and some that are always bad, right? There's some that are okay depending on their usage.
Right.
And then there's some that are always going to be bad.
Yes. Yes. But the physical pleasures are not part of the pursuit of the truth.
Oh, they're not?
No, it's only the pleasures of the soul.
Really?
Yeah, that's what he's arguing.
Where do the pleasures of the body come in?
There's a proper order of them in relation to the proper living of a human life. But they're not the pleasures that will lead you to divine truth. They're not the pleasures that are mixed in as part of perceiving divine truth.
They're kind of incidental.
They're incidental, yes.
All they can do is get in the way.
Yes, right. They can get in the way, but they don't necessarily have to be obstacles.
But can't they help? So they can't help at all?
No.
All right, what about the person that says, like at the beginning of the Republic, what about the person who says this? I'm very Socratically distancing myself from this argument. Right? It says that they got Socrates to stay because of the horse races. That's how they got him to stay, because of the light that he would take and watching the horse races. Is there any validity there?
I would say this. The most validity there is that it's a kind of curiosity. It's a kind of curiosity that you leave behind once the true intellectual inquiry begins.
Okay, so it could be kind of like an impetus.
It could be an impetus, but it's not the actual pursuit of the divine. Yes.
So football can't lead you to the truth?
No, it's only an image. Yeah, that's in the Republic. Things like sports or music, or maybe music might be different, but sports, they're an imitation of what virtue might be, but they're not virtue itself. So that by doing them, you might learn the structure of what's required as part of virtue. So in other words, I may learn by throwing a football every day that I got to throw a football every day to stay good at it. But that's not virtue. What that teaches me is that if I want to become temperate, every day I got to control what I eat. But there's not a relationship between the two. There's not a direct link between the two. Just because I can throw the football every day doesn't mean that I'm going to live temperance. But that might teach me the structure of what might be involved in learning temperance.
Wouldn't that maybe require a certain amount of virtue in order to be able to do the sport well?
But it's a different virtue than temperance. It's a different virtue than that which controls my eating.
Don't you think that the strength of the will in one sector would help in others?
Not necessarily. It could, but not necessarily. Because there's a lot of football players that are, quite frankly, beasts. And training every day has not helped them live chastity, for example. In other words, they have the conditions for living virtue if they choose to live virtue. But that doesn't mean that they live virtue.
So they can be helps. they don't necessarily apply.
Yes, right.
Seriously, if anybody wants any spoons.
So we've already gone over. I might have one. We've already gone over the last part, which is the place of pleasure, and then also how Socrates will not concede that pleasure is our ultimate good, even if all the beasts argue to the contrary. He also hints at the end that oftentimes in this life, people trust in the pleasures as the magicians trust in their formulas. And the many often judge things by pleasures. They judge pleasure to be the greatest blessing in life. They think that the lusts of beasts are better witnesses than the aspirations and thoughts of the philosophical muse. I think that's a very appropriate way of putting it. Now, that's all I want to say about the Philebus. Does anybody have any final questions about the Philebus?
Do you think there's any particular reason for its position in the dialogues coming after the Statesman? It seemed like an abrupt change, because the Statesman, it was like, you finally sound like we got some people who actually know what's going on.
Right.
Like Philebus is like, he seems like he should be back with the old tautologies.
I think what's going on here is that even after the Statesman, once we've done the Statesman, should I drink out of this? Once we've done the Statesman, someone might... The Statesman is the final dialogue of dialectic. And now we're returning to the world. Once we return to the world, someone might think, oh, I can be the clever philosopher now, the clever philosopher king, and I can basically manipulate the passions and pleasures.
This is temperance against that.
And I could maybe have everybody else live an ordered life, and I would live a nihilistic life. So I think he's trying to basically, at the beginning of this tetralogy, say, this is going to be the real challenge now. What is the real statesman? What is the real philosopher in the world like? Is it someone who lives a kind of double life? Or is it someone who really tries to bring order to society? And what does order in society really mean? Does it mean a kind of... in the 60s, in the conservative movement in America, no thanks. In the 60s, in the Republican Party in America, there was always this tension between, on the one hand, the libertarians. There were libertarians who could care less about morality, but they thought that society needed a kind of order so that we could economically prosper. Also in the 50s and 60s, there were people like Bertrand Russell who thought that communism was bad because communism inhibited freedom. But the only difference between communism and Catholicism is that communism inhibited freedom in a worse way than Catholicism. Right? So there was kind of an alliance made in the 50s and 60s between libertarians, Catholics, and Democrats. Democrats who were like Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was an atheist who was a sexual revolutionary, but he was against communism. Catholics, libertarians, were against communism because it went against economic order. Catholics were against communism because they killed Catholics. And also because it's materialistic and atheistic. But Bertrand Russell and the libertarians, they could care less about its materialism or its atheism. Right? Well, these three groups in the U.S., they kind of forged an alliance in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of the conservatives and then the Democrats, they basically said, well, for now, we'll accept order in society, but there's no ultimate truth. So the Philebus is written for those kind of people. Right? This is once the philosopher returns to the world, there are some people who are going to be pretenders, either pretend philosophers or pretend statesmen, who are going to say, we have some vision of what order is. In the case of the libertarians, order is economic order. In the case of the sexual revolutionaries, order is freedom, which allows me to be a prevert. Right? I mean, that's what it is.
Got a few people looking at you.
This is your apostrophe.
Freedom to be a favorite.
Speaking out of the sword.
So,
Shouting from the rooftops.
shouting from the rooftops.
Eating scones.
Well, the one time I met Pope John Paul II, the message was, now is the time to shout from the rooftops. I'm just doing what the Pope told me.
And as far as you're concerned, he's done everything you've asked him, right?
Yeah, he always does what I told him to do, so why shouldn't I do what he tells me to do? It's a mutual love fest. In the true sense of the word love, if you've read the Symposium.
Yeah, for the good of the church, right?
Well, based on...
Agape fest.
Yeah.
City
Free agape.
I saw for the first time the Agape Cab Company today. I was very
Oh yeah, I saw one of those, yeah.
T-shirts.
But it's really disappointing.
Huh?
The agape company. It's not nearly as agape as you think.
No. So anyway, the challenge of the Symposium is to lay out that this is the goal we're fighting against. We're fighting against now those who have a kind of knowledge of the order of divine things, but will misuse it. And that's both, I think, the Philebus and the Timaeus. And this is the transition, I think, to the Timaeus. The name Timaeus means Mr. Pride. Yeah. Or it could also mean the guy who follows honor. Right? Because Timeo is honor. Timaea is honor. Right? Yeah. So it's the guy who follows honor. That's the first fall away from the virtuous regime in the Republic. You'll notice that the beginning of the Timaeus is a summary of the middle parts of the Republic. But it leaves off the third wave. The third wave in Book 5 is the wave of the philosopher king. Either philosophers have to become kings or kings have to become philosophers. So the Timaeus will be a kind of philosophical science ultimately without philosophical wisdom. So there's going to be a lot we can learn from it about the forms and about causality, but it's going to be lacking something. Ironically also, who are the characters of the Timaeus? The characters are Timaeus. Timaeus is a scientist. Timaeus is like a pre-Socratic philosopher. He's from Sicily. He's a scientist from Sicily. Who's Critias? Critias is a sophist from Athens. He's a wise man from Athens. And who's Hermocrates? Hermocrates was the leader of Syracuse when Syracuse defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War. In other words, he was the statesman who saved Syracuse. So the characters in the beginning of this dialogue are a really smart scientist who is almost a philosopher, a really smart sophist who is almost a philosopher, and a really smart statesman who might be a philosopher. I just want to forewarn you that once you get to about 30 or so in the Timaeus, it gets very hard to read. It's all sorts of strange and bizarre things. I'm going to send you some notes. And after about 35 or so, basically, just you almost might just want to read the notes I send you, rather than, you almost might want to, after 35 or so, you might want to just skim through the Timaeus.
It's about when the bronze sphere just popped its head up.
Pardon?
When the bronze sphere pops its head up.
Yeah. So read the Egyptian myth and everything, because that's pretty interesting. But after the Egyptian myth is over, it gets really bizarre. And it might be more helpful for you to skim through it. Read very fast.
I got bogged down in it.
Yeah. Read really fast, but read the notes, maybe almost instead of... Read the notes that I send you. Because what's going on that's interesting in the Timaeus, part of the notes I'm going to send you, well, this go to this web. Actually, almost I might say, instead of reading the notes I send you, go to the website Plato and his dialogues, and read all the links that he has to the Timaeus. Yeah, because there's a lot of it's almost as if the Timaeus is setting up the laws for us. It also is the case that in Timaeus we get the real theory of the forms. And the theory of the forms is not what you were taught whenever you were taught Plato by anybody else. Basically, the form, just real briefly here, there's 4 forms. The first kind of form is the form that deals with the form of matter, the form of this table, the form of the cup, the form of matter. The second kind of form is the form of the human body, which is the soul. This kind of form is the biological form of man. There's a third kind of form, which is the spiritual soul.
Wait, so what do you mean by, you said the form of human body, which was the soul?
In other words, I guess what he's saying is that there's the second kind of form would be like, a lot of times we say, when we speak, we say there are psychosomatic problems. In other words, there's an aspect of the human person which is both physical and spiritual at the same time, but it's not purely spiritual. That would be the second form.
Okay.
There are psychological problems which are partly physical and partly spiritual. That would be a sign of the second form.
How does that work?
Just read. I'm introducing it.
Okay.
It's explained here. It's explained on the table.
Okay.
We only have 10 minutes.
Okay, sorry.
The third kind of form is the spiritual form. And the fourth kind of form are really the ideas in the mind of God, like justice, or being, or truth, or goodness. The Republic is a dialogue that is trying to explain the fourth kind of form, that is justice. The Timaeus is a dialogue that is trying to get us to see how these fourth kind of forms are possible. And a big part of the Timaeus is trying to get us to see that there's an order. You remember in the Philebus, he says first you have the eternal, then you have a second order, then you have nous. Well, the Timaeus is trying to explain these three orders. The order that is primary to human, or that is before. There's an order that is prior to human wisdom. The Timaeus is trying to help us get at the order that is prior to human wisdom. The divine order, the eternal order. I think the Timaeus was one of the few dialogues that was in existence throughout the whole of the Middle Ages. I think you can see how the Timaeus might resonate with Christian thinking. Ultimately, it could be that Timaeus himself is not capable of logos. He might be too attached to a kind of scientific. He might be too much like Stephen Hawkins. He might be too attached to a scientific explanation of things and a scientific explanation of necessity that he lacks access to divine wisdom. That doesn't mean that we can't learn from him. There still might be a lot that we can learn from him as far as the order of divine wisdom. So Timaeus might be another kind of Cephalus from the Republic. A guy who can help us get it started in speaking about divine things and about the eternal harmony or the eternal order in things, but who himself is incapable of carrying through that discussion. In other words, the mythos, the myth of Timaeus, might lack logos, just as the science of the pre-Socratics lacked full logos. The only way we can arrive at full logos is by acquiring the science of philosophy, which helps us put myth, science, pleasure, wisdom in its proper order. In other words, the philosopher is the logos of the logos of the logos. The philosopher discovers the logos of the logos of the logos. In other words, there's a human logos.
Different orders.
There's a human logos. There's a logos of necessary things, and there's an eternal logos. And so the philosopher tries to discover the logos of the logos of the logos. The scientist discovers the logos of what is necessary, or maybe the myth, because he can't discover all that is necessary. But in the end, it's not the fullness of the logos. So ultimately, what we're going to get at, eventually Aquinas will say this in a way. Everything we're going to read in the Timaeus and the Laws, Aquinas will say it in a way that we can probably understand it better in the Treatise on Law. There's a divine order or a divine harmony to things. That's the eternal law. I think what's nice about Plato saying it is that we tend to think of law as, something you got to follow. But here we're speaking more about order or harmony, which is more than law, more than what we think of law. But ultimately what we're going to get at is that there's a divine order or harmony to things. And the Timaeus is going to lay out for us the big picture of the divine order or harmony of things. We learned from the Philebus that we have to ultimately understand human pleasure within that divine order or harmony. And ultimately, we also learned from the Philebus, and we learned from the introduction to the Timaeus, where we have all these political figures, that the true statesman, the true political community, which we'll get in the laws, will account for pleasure, wisdom, and the divine order of things. Right? The true political community, in other words, human wisdom, the divine order of things, the divine order of things is the eternal law. The divine order of things is the eternal law. Nous, N-O-U-S, or human wisdom, is the natural law. And the laws will be, well, how do you create a political community that harmonizes all of this? Right? How do you create a political community that harmonizes all of this? That will be the laws. So in some sense, the Philebus and the Timaeus is a preparation for the laws. It's the context for the laws. And one of the pages of this he has set up, he shows all the parallels between the Timaeus and the laws. And I would like you to look at that page.